in 2009, I lived with 2 roommates above a daycare in Park Slope, and I was wearing a lot of shorts with boots. It was a thing. The 10-year challenge that you've seen popping up all over social media is a great excuse for your friends to casually show how much more attractive they are than they were a decade ago, perhaps thanks to the fact that they're no longer wearing shorts with boots. But we thought it would be a great excuse to see how Brooklyn has changed since 2009. And we've brought on Nick Rizzo, ex-bartender, future locksmith, political animal, and general know-it-all to take a walk down memory lane with us. Nick, welcome back to 112BK.
So great to be here. Thanks, MacKenzie.
So, first category for our trip down memory lane, the state senate. What did the state senate look like in 2009? What does it look like today?
So this is an interesting parallel to today. In January of 2009, Democrats had just won the state senate for the first time in forever. There was a lot of optimism about what sort of changes should occur. But instead, in the summer of 2009, a group of renegade Democrats in the Senate defected to the Republican side briefly for their own aggrandizement. And basically everybody involved in that Senate coup, as it was called, the 2009 Albany Senate coup, almost every single one of those people went to prison eventually for other reasons. It was more or less a criminal conspiracy, actually. Flash forward to today, we're feeling a little bit better about the state Senate. Shortly after the Senate coup, Democrats lost the state Senate and did not retake it until this November. So now we're a few weeks into Democratic control of the state Senate, and they've already passed a lot of measures, including
the RHA.
RHA yesterday with my friend Julia Salazar helped pass that to fully legalize abortion and contraception here in New York State. We also have done stuff for Dreamers. They've done stuff to close the so-called LLC loophole in campaign financing, early voting. So there's been a lot that's happened already.
So far, no coups.
So far, no coups. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
That's right. All right, next up, term limits.
Yeah.
In 2009, those existed.
Yeah. So again, this is one of those, in TV, you might call them bottle episodes, where something happens over the course of the episode, and by the end of the episode, things have kind of gone back to the status quo. So in the wake of the financial crisis, remember that, folks? Mike Bloomberg felt that he was the only person who could be New York City mayor, who had the gravitas for that, so he extended term limits. He got the makeup heir billionaire who supported term limits originally to agree to that extension. And that kind of changed the landscape in terms of who was running for mayor that year. He got to run for mayor again. He beat Comptroller Bill Thompson, and he was mayor for 4 more years. And then since then, the city council has repealed that. So we don't have term limits anymore. Or we do have term limits again.
We do have term limits.
Sorry.
In 2009, Anthony Weiner was also considering tossing his hat into the ring. And this was pre-Carlos Danger. Or maybe he was Carlos Danger. We just didn't know about it.
Right.
Can you envision what 2019 might look like if Weiner had run and
Sure.
won?
So one of Bloomberg's moves around the term limits 10 years ago were definitely shaped viewing with Anthony Weiner in mind. I think the Bloomberg camp felt that Weiner was the strongest opponent. So they released a bunch of bad stories about him. Ultimately not as bad as the stories would end up being, but about how he liked to... I mean, I think we can all acknowledge it was a different time, sort of, right?
Sure.
And basically every day there was another bad story about Anthony Weiner before he decided to run, when he was deciding whether to run for mayor or not. And in the end, he decided not to, and they hung up a big goalie mask in the Bloomberg campaign headquarters because Anthony Weiner used to play hockey. So Weiner was a really big deal back then. Looked like he very well could be the future mayor. Then he had a really bad scandal. Then he came back from that scandal. Then he had another scandal.
Right. What a difference a decade makes. Let's talk about taxis. If I wanted to take a car somewhere in New York in 2009, what would I have done?
Yeah, there used to be a bunch of car services that you would actually call with your phone. You couldn't open an app. You actually had
you
to
would dial the phone number.
dial a phone number on your phone.
On your flip phone.
On a flip phone, exactly. You couldn't T9 them or do anything else with texting. You had to actually call them.
And yellow cabs. Yellow cabs were much more a part of our daily lives.
Yeah, but it was a whole thing that if you were getting into it, you could get a yellow cab in Manhattan. If you were taking the yellow cab out to Brooklyn, you had to be very careful to make sure you were inside the cab before you said Brooklyn, because otherwise they'd refuse.
Right.
Once they were in Brooklyn, pretty much they would just drive back to Manhattan as quickly as they could. So unless you were on sort of like 4th Avenue and Park Slope or say McGinnis Boulevard and Greenpoint, there are only a few places that you could kind of hope to regularly catch a yellow cab, and it would be only on their route back to Manhattan.
That's
really only useful to go to Manhattan.
In 2013, a yellow cab medallion was worth as much as $1.3 million. Today, however, because of competition from Uber and Lyft, it could be as low as $160,000.
It might be lower than that, to be honest. The market for yellow cab medallions is no longer liquid. It used to be high because it was barely liquid. It was very hard to get your hands on one, and no one wanted to sell them. And there'd be take out kind of very fancy loans on them. They were considered very stable collateral. There's no. As far as I can tell, there's no point to having a taxi medallion anymore.
And this has led to like a terrible spate of taxi driver suicides and people who are deeply in debt and have no way of bailing themselves out.
It's terrifically depressing.
Yes.
Capitalism, eh?
Speaking of capitalism, let's talk about gentrification. I feel like we could, spend an entire hour just talking about, like, remember this place we loved in 2009 that's now a high-rise? Yeah. But talk to me a little bit about what the borough looked like 10 years ago as compared to now.
I would say the main casualty is performance venues. I mean, there's not just that. Obviously, affordable housing is much harder to get by. There's a lot of things that have changed in our borough real estate-wise in the last decade, and mostly not for the better unless you happen to own that real estate.
That's right. I saw in doing some research that Studio B, which was sort of on the Greenpoint, North Williamsburg border, is now a single-family live workspace that sold for $11 million.
Wow. Yeah. For a while, it's hard to keep track, but there was one that I thought was Studio B that was supposed to become a Mercedes showroom, I want to say. Not really like a place that you could actually go and buy a Mercedes in, but more of like a cool space where you can experience what it's like to be a Mercedes owner.
Sure. Any plutocrats who listen to the show, give us a tweet. We'd love to have you on. Talk about your life.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. How many Brooklyn plutocrats are there? A few. There's a few.
Plenty. All right, final bonus round. The MTA, 2009, pre-Sandy.
Yeah.
You mentioned the G train wasn't running as well, but pretty much every other train was running better.
Ridership increased for a number of years after 2009 and now has been decreasing for the last year or two as people just can't even.
We have a ridership increase of 147 million over the last 10 years. That seems crazy.
Yeah, it was big. It was basically all of our city's population increase, which luckily New York was kind of plateaued at about 8.1 million for a number of years, and now we're growing again. All that growth was for a while going into the subways, which I think is good. It's the most efficient way that people can travel around the city. But I think over the last couple of years, we've seen a slight decrease in official ridership, and people aren't sure whether that's due to fare dodging or ride-hail services.
Or Mercedes
dealerships. Or people are just sick of the unreliability of feeling like every day on your commute you don't know when you're actually going to get to work.
Sure.
I think I would be remiss not to note that how regular people in Brooklyn view gender and class and maybe race has changed a lot in the last decade. So I think honestly, not all these changes are great. I miss Glasslands, and I imagine you miss Southpaw, but and I don't like paying what I pay in rent anymore. But overall, I'm really happy that I'm still in Brooklyn 10 years later, and I think a lot of these changes are for the best.
Yeah, that's a good summation. That changing social attitudes, that there is progress.
Yeah.
Even while it feels like your interminable wait for the C train is anything but progress.
I think the world is falling apart, but in some ways I think the city is getting better and better.
Well, Nick Rizzo, thank you so much for joining us.
MacKenzie, great to have me. Thanks so much for being on 112BK. Can't wait to come back.